The high desert held a special kind of silence, a vast, dry quiet that seemed to swallow sound whole. In the middle of this empty expanse, the Willow Creek Ranch clung to life like a tenacious weed. Its fences sagged. The paint on the clapboard house was blistered and peeling, the color of sun-bleached bone. A widow lived here, a woman named Margaret. She stood at the sink, her hands deep in cool, soapy water, staring out the window at the land that was slowly, stubbornly, slipping through her fingers. Her husband, Thomas, had seen promise in this harsh place 5 years ago. He'd seen the single, stubborn line of willow trees by the thin creek and dreamed of fat cattle and a full barn. The fever took him fast 2 winters back, leaving Margaret with the dream and the relentless, backbreaking reality of it. Now, the barn was half empty, the cattle were few and lean, and the weight of it all sat on her shoulders like a heavy yoke. More immediate than the work was the threat. Silas Gable, who owned the sprawling ranch to the east, had started making visits. His words were polite, but his eyes were like chips of flint. "A woman can't manage this," he'd say, leaning on her fence. "It's too much. Sell to me, get a tidy sum, move to town where it's safe." She knew his idea of a tidy sum was a robbery, and his idea of safe was anywhere she wasn't. She'd refused, each time, her voice steady even as her heart rattled against her ribs. But refusal, she knew, wouldn't last forever. Gable was a man used to getting his way. That's what drove her into town that afternoon, the dust of the road coating her worn skirts. The town of Bitter Spring was just a clutch of wooden buildings, but it held her last hope. She needed a hired hand. Strong, willing to work for room and board and a small wage, and not in Gable's pocket. She asked at the livery, the general store. Men tipped their hats, shook their heads. Good help was scarce, and a failing ranch owned by a woman wasn't a tempting prospect. Defeat was a sour taste in her mouth as she stood on the boardwalk, the sun beating down. Her eyes drifted to the saloon, the Golden Spur. It was the last place she wanted to go, a dark, male space that felt like a cave. But necessity was a sharper spur than pride. She pushed through the batwing doors, the smell of stale beer and old sweat hitting her. The room fell quiet for a beat, all male eyes turning to her. She ignored them, her gaze scanning the shadows. And there, in the far corner where the light barely reached, she saw him. A man sitting alone, a half-empty glass of whiskey before him. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't laughing or arguing. He was perfectly still, like a mountain cat at rest. He wore a dark coat, dusty from travel, and a hat pulled low. But it was his posture that told the story, a slight, careful stiffening in his left side, the way he held his right arm loose and ready. A wounded animal. And on the table near his glass, just visible, was the well-worn handle of a revolver. A gunslinger. Or a former one. The town's whispers about a stranger who'd been in a fight up north filtered back to her. Most women would have turned and fled. Margaret saw something else. She saw the exhaustion in the line of his shoulders, deeper than any simple tiredness. She saw a man who was as worn and used up as her own land. He wasn't a predator here, he was adrift. She walked over, the floorboards creaking under her boots. He didn't look up until her shadow fell across his table. "They tell me you're looking for work," she said, her voice cutting through the saloon's murmur. Slowly, he lifted his head. His face was all hard angles and weathered skin, framed by dark hair that needed cutting. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, and just as distant. They held no greeting, only a careful, neutral assessment. He gave a single, slight nod. "I have work. A season's worth. Room in the bunkhouse, 3 meals a day, and $15 at the end of it, if we make it that far." She laid the terms out, plain and bare as the dirt outside. She saw the faint flicker in his eyes at the mention of the bunkhouse, the meals. A man without options. The ranch is Willow Creek. My name is Margaret. He was silent for a long moment, his gaze holding hers. He was reading her, she realized, just as she had read him. Seeing the stubborn set of her jaw, the desperation she tried to hide, the clean, honest weariness that matched his own. Jack, he said finally. His voice was low, rough from disuse, like stone grinding on stone. What's the work? Everything, she said honestly. Fences, cattle, repairs. It's just me. And there's a neighbor who would prefer I wasn't there. A ghost of something passed over his face, not surprise, but recognition. He understood trouble. He looked down at his glass, then out the saloon window toward the harsh, open land. It was a place to hide. To heal. A simple bargain. He nodded again. I'll take it. The ride back to the ranch in her buckboard was made in total silence. Jack sat beside her, his body moving easily with the wagon's roll, his eyes constantly moving over the landscape, noting the lay of the land, the gullies, the stand of trees. It was the habit of a man who had lived by watching. Margaret focused on the reins, on the familiar rhythm of the horses. She had just invited a wolf into her fold, she thought. Or perhaps she had found another wounded creature to mend. The first days were a careful dance of work and watchfulness. She showed him the broken fence line, the failing pump, the thin herd. He listened, asked a few short questions, and set to work. He was strong, his hands clever with tools, and he worked with a silent, focused efficiency that wasted no movement. He spoke only when necessary. Nails are over there. That bay mare is favoring her left fore. Storm coming in from the west. She responded in kind, their conversations purely about the tasks at hand. She cooked, he ate with a quiet appreciation. He slept in the bunkhouse, a small, separate building, and she in the main house. The ranch felt different with another presence on it, not safer yet, but less utterly, achingly alone. The wound on his side needed tending. He'd tried to do it himself, but she'd seen the clumsily wrapped bandage, the faint stain of blood. One evening after supper, she approached him on the porch where he sat cleaning his rifle, a task he performed with a ritualistic care. She held out a roll of clean linen and a small jar of salve. "Let me see to that," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. It was the voice she used with a sick calf. Jack's shoulders tightened. That space was private, vulnerable. He looked at her face, not at her hands, and saw no pity, only a practical need to keep her hired hand from festering. After a long pause, he gave a tight nod. He didn't move to the house, but remained on the porch step, unbuttoning his shirt with stiff fingers. He pulled the fabric aside, revealing the bandage wrapped around his lean torso. Margaret knelt beside him in the fading light. Her fingers, competent and gentle, worked at the knot. As the linen fell away, she saw the wound, an angry, puckered red hole just above his hip, stitched with crude, functional knots. It was healing, but it was ugly and hot to the touch. She said nothing. She dipped her fingers in the salve, its scent of herbs and beeswax cutting through the evening air. When she applied it, her touch was firm and sure. Jack flinched, not from pain, but from the shock of it. It had been so long since he'd been touched without violence. Her skin was cool, her fingers calloused but soft in a way a man's hands never were. He held his breath, staring straight ahead at the purple horizon, acutely aware of her closeness. He could smell the sun and dust in her hair, the faint, clean scent of soap on her skin. It was a good smell, a real smell, not the false perfumes of saloon women or the coppery stench of blood. Her ministrations were clinical, but the simple human care in them was of foreign and unsettling kindness. A strange, long-dormant heat began to uncoil in his belly, unrelated to the fire in his side. For Margaret, the moment was equally shifting. Seeing the wound made him real in a new way, a man of flesh that could be torn, who had bled and suffered. Her eyes traced not just the new injury, but the other marks that mapped his body, a pale, thin scar along a rib, a older, rougher patch on his shoulder. A history of violence written on his skin. Yet under her fingers, his skin was warm and alive, the muscles of his abdomen tense but solid. She found her own breath coming shorter, her focus narrowing from the wound to the sheer physical presence of him. This was not the broken figure in the saloon's shadow, this was a powerful, living man, allowing her this vulnerability. A flush crept up her neck that had nothing to do with the day's heat. She finished, securing the new bandage with a neat knot. Her hands lingered for a second too long on the warm plane of his side before she pulled away, standing abruptly. "Keep it clean," she said, her voice slightly huskier than she intended. Jack pulled his shirt together, buttoning it with fingers that felt clumsy. "Obliged," he murmured, the word thick in his throat. He couldn't meet her eyes. They separated then, to their separate dwellings. But the silence of the night was different. In her narrow bed, Margaret stared into the dark, her fingertips tingling with the memory of his skin. The heat of him, the surprising smoothness over the hard muscle, the way his breath had hitched. It was a simple act of care, but it had stirred something deep and neglected within her, a yearning she had buried with Thomas. In the bunkhouse, Jack lay on his hard cot, the scent of her salve on his skin, the ghost of her touch burning brighter than the pain in his side. He stared at the rafters, seeing not the wood but the determined set of her mouth, the way a strand of honey-colored hair had escaped her braid and curled against her damp temple. She was a strong woman, stronger than any he'd known, rooted to this hard piece of earth. And for the first time since he could remember, he didn't just see a place to hide. He saw a woman he wanted to look at again tomorrow. The vast desert silence outside seemed to pulse with a new, waiting potential. The bargain had been struck, but the first, fragile thread of something else had been spun in the twilight on that porch, a thread as fine as spider silk and, for now, just as easily broken. The season turned, the hard blue of the sky softening to a dusty gold as the sun began its slower arc toward winter. On the Willow Creek, the rhythm established in that first week hardened into a routine that was both a balm and a subtle cage. Margaret and Jack moved around each other like two separate currents in the same stream, their work dovetailing with a quiet efficiency that spoke of growing understanding, if not yet ease. He had taken over the heavy repairs, his strength and innate skill evident in the straight, taut lines of the new fence posts, the solid feel of the barn door on its hinges. She managed the garden, the chickens, the endless cooking and mending, her eyes always calculating, always weighing the ranch's fragile balance. The thread of Silas Gable was the constant, low hum beneath the surface of their days. He did not come himself again, but his presence was felt. One morning, they rode out to the north pasture to find a long section of fence wire cut clean through, the barbs lying curled on the ground like malicious snakes. A dozen head of cattle were gone, their tracks pointing east toward Gable's vast holdings. Margaret stood before the breach, her hands clenched at her sides, a quiet fury trembling through her. It wasn't the loss of the cattle, painful as it was the violation, the mockery of her struggle. Jack said nothing. He simply dismounted, examined the cut ends of wire, then studied the ground. His face, usually so closed, settled into lines of cold focus. "They'll have driven them through the dry wash, then up into his south range," he said, his voice devoid of emotion. "I'll go. It's his land, Jack. If they catch you, He looked at her then, and the winter in his eyes had a new, sharp edge. They cut your fence. They stole from you. The word "your" hung between them, weighted. He wasn't just a hired hand following orders, this was a personal line that had been crossed. I won't be caught. He said it not as a boast, but as a simple fact, like stating the time of day. It was the first real glimpse he gave her of the man he had been, a man who moved through dangerous spaces by being quieter, smarter, and deadlier than anyone else. He was gone for the rest of the day and into the deepening twilight. Margaret tried to occupy herself with chores, but her gaze kept drifting to the eastern horizon, her stomach a tight knot of dread. She wasn't afraid for her cattle, but for the still, quiet man who had ridden out to face wolves on her behalf. When she finally heard the distant lowing of cattle and saw the dark shape of a rider herding them home against the violet sky, a relief so profound it weakened her knees washed through her. He brought all 12 head back. His shirt was torn at the shoulder, and a fresh, dark bruise was blooming on his jaw. They won't be back this way, was all he said as he dismounted, his movements stiff. He didn't elaborate on the confrontation at Gable's lined shack, the way he had materialized from the gathering shadows, how his voice, low and flat as a grave slab, had promised consequences far beyond the return of a few skinny cows if they ever touched the widow's property again. The fear in the hired man's eyes had been answer enough. That evening, the air between them had changed. The careful distance had been bridged by an act of fierce, unasked-for protection. Margaret cooked a better supper than usual, a precious jar of preserved peaches opened beside the stew. They ate at the small kitchen table, the lamplight pooling between them. The silence was different, no longer empty but full of things unsaid. "Thank you, Jack," she said, her voice soft in the quiet room. He nodded, his eyes meeting hers across the table. In the warm light, they looked less like winter and more like a calm sea. "This is your place," he said, as if that explained everything. Then, haltingly, he began to speak. Not of the day's events, but of before. Fragments, offered like small, hard stones. The years of moving from town to town, the weight of the gun on his hip, the faces of men he'd rather forget. "A man gets tired," he said, staring into his coffee cup. Tired of the noise, the smell of blood, himself. Margaret listened, her own heart aching for the loneliness in his words. When he finished, she found herself speaking of Thomas. Not of the grief, which was a private, scarred-over place, but of the dream. He saw this creek, these willows, and he saw a future. "I'm just trying to hold on to the pieces of it." "You're building it," Jack corrected quietly. "Fence by fence. It's more than most ever do." It was the first real kindness he'd spoken, and it landed in her chest with a warmth that spread through her. They were no longer just a widow and a gunslinger. They were two people who had seen the worst of life, recognizing the quiet, stubborn good in the other. The storm rolled in 2 days later, a sudden, violent tantrum of the heavens. The sky turned a sickly green, then black, and the wind screamed down from the mountains, driving sheets of cold rain before it. They worked frantically as the first drops fell, securing tools, herding the animals into the sturdy barn, battening down shutters. The creek, usually a timid trickle, became a roaring brown torrent. By the time they stumbled into the barn, the last sanctuary, they were both soaked to the skin. The air inside was thick with the smell of damp hay, warm horseflesh, and the sharp tang of ozone. Rain drummed a frantic rhythm on the roof, and the single lantern hanging from a beam swung wildly, casting swooping, monstrous shadows. Margaret shivered violently, her wet clothes clinging to her like a cold second skin. Her teeth chattered. Jack, breathing hard from the exertion, glanced at her. Without a word, he grabbed the rough horse blanket from a nearby stall and held it out. Then, seeing her hands were numb and shaking, he made a decision. He turned away from her slightly and began to unbutton his own soaked denim shirt. He peeled it off with a soft, wet sound, wringing it out before draping it over a partition. "Put the blanket on," he said, his back to her. "Get those wet things off underneath it." He was giving her privacy, but in doing so, he revealed himself. In the swinging lantern light, Margaret's gaze was drawn irrevocably to the expanse of his bare back and shoulders. Water droplets traced paths through the dust and sweat on his skin. She saw the powerful cords of muscle, the old white scar on his shoulder she'd felt before, now a vivid map in the golden light. But she also saw more, the elegant, dangerous taper of his waist, the ridge of his spine, the way his body was a landscape of both strength and survival. He was beautiful, not in a gentle way, but in the way a well-made weapon is beautiful, all function and latent power. Her breath caught. The cold was forgotten, replaced by a sudden, pooling heat low in her belly. She fumbled with her own buttons, her fingers clumsy, sliding the wet dress from her shoulders under the cover of the scratchy blanket. The wool was rough against her skin, but the warmth was immediate. She stood there, swaddled, watching him. He turned back, perhaps to check on her, and froze. She was just a shape in a blanket, but her hair had come completely loose, a cascade of dark gold waves plastered with rain, tumbling over her shoulders and the rough wool. Her face was pale, her eyes huge and dark in the flickering light, fixed on him. They stared at each other across a few feet of hay-strewn floor, and the space between them seemed to crackle, as alive as the lightning outside. Jack's eyes traveled from her face down the length of the blanket, then back up. The careful neutrality he always wore was gone, stripped away by the storm and this raw, intimate proximity. His gaze was hot, open, full of a wanting so stark it made her legs feel weak. He took one step toward her, then another, closing the distance. He stopped so close she could feel the heat radiating from his bare skin, could see the rapid pulse at the base of his throat. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lifted a hand. His fingertips, calloused and warm, brushed a soaking strand of hair from her cheek, tucking it behind her ear. The touch was a brand. Margaret swayed toward him, a tiny, involuntary movement. That was all the answer he needed. With a low sound that was half groan, half sigh, he bent his head. His mouth found hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was the release of weeks of silent watching, of buried longing, of shared toil and unspoken understanding. It was hungry and desperate, a claiming and an offering all at once. His lips were firm, insistent, and she met them with equal fervor, her hands coming up from under the blanket to clutch at his powerful arms. The feel of his bare skin under her palms, solid and alive, sent a jolt of pure lightning through her. She whimpered into his mouth, and the sound seemed to unravel something in him. One of his arms banded around her back, crushing the blanket between them, pulling her flush against the hard, heated length of his body. The other hand came up to cradle the back of her head, his fingers tangling in her wet hair. The kiss deepened, turned exploratory, tasting of rain and shared breath and a longing so profound it felt like coming home. The storm outside reached a fever pitch, wind howling, but inside the barn there was only the sound of their ragged breathing, the soft, wet sounds of their kiss, and the thunder of their own hearts. Margaret forgot the cold, the ranch, the threat of Gable. There was only this, the shocking heat of him, the delicious scrape of his chest against the blanket and her sensitive skin beneath, the masterful way his mouth moved on hers, drawing a response from her she didn't know she possessed. She arched into him, and felt the hard, unmistakable evidence of his desire press against her. A fresh wave of heat, liquid and urgent, flooded her core. Just as her knees truly threatened to give way, as her hands began to slide from his arms to explore the hard planes of his back, a sudden, deafening crack of thunder shook the very foundations of the barn, followed by the distinct, sickening sound of a tree limb splitting outside. The spell, for a moment, was shattered. Jack tore his mouth from hers, resting his forehead against hers, his breathing a ragged storm in her ear. His body was tensed, vibrating with the effort of stopping. The lantern swung wildly, throwing their tangled shadow against the wall. The rain, abruptly, began to slacken. The fury of the storm was passing, moving on to vex some other part of the desert. In the sudden, relative quiet, the reality of what was happening, what was about to happen, crashed back in. They were employer and hired hand. They were in a barn. They were both half-dressed and utterly lost in each other. He pulled back, just enough to look into her eyes. His were dark, dilated, his pupils swallowing the gray. The want was still there, a banked fire, but a new wariness was there too, a fear of having taken too much. He searched her face, not saying a word, the question hanging in the damp air between them. Margaret, her own body singing with unmet need, her lips swollen from his kisses, simply looked back. She offered no reassurance, no permission, but in her eyes was no regret, only a reflection of his own turbulent hunger. The decision of what came next was suspended, precious and terrifying, in the dripping silence left by the storm. The thread spun on the porch had not broken. It had been woven into a strong, taut cord, pulling them irresistibly together, and neither of them knew how to, or wanted to, cut it. The days that followed the storm were charged with a new and potent electricity. The work continued, the fences needed mending from the wind, the garden needed tending, but every shared glance across the yard, every passing of a tool from his hand to hers, every evening meal eaten in the thickening silence of the kitchen, was imbued with the memory of the barn. The taste of that kiss, the feel of his bare skin under her palms, the hard press of his body against hers, hung in the air between them, a third presence as tangible as the dust or the sun. They spoke even less than before, but the quiet was no longer empty, it was dense, humming with things powerfully felt and dangerously unsaid. Margaret found her eyes tracing the line of his shoulders as he worked, remembering the smooth, hot strength of them. Jack watched the sway of her skirts, the way her neck curved when she bent to pull a weed, and the memory of her damp hair between his fingers would hit him with a force that stole his breath. This tense, fragile peace was shattered one afternoon when Jack rode out to the far west range to check on a spring. He was gone longer than the task warranted, a slow, cold dread coiling in Margaret's gut as the sun began to dip. Finally, she saw his horse trotting back, riderless. The saddle was empty. Ice flooded her veins. She ran to the animal, her hands flying over the reins, finding no note, no sign of struggle, but the message was clear. This was a lure, and she had taken the bait by staying home, by being the predictable weakness. As if summoned by her terror, a buckboard rolled up the main track. Silas Gable himself was at the reins, with two of his larger, rougher hands riding alongside on horseback. They pulled up before her porch with an air of casual ownership that made her blood run cold. Gable tipped his hat, a smile on his face that didn't touch his cold eyes. "Afternoon, Margaret. You look concerned. Where is he?" Her voice was flat, hard, all her fear forced down into a solid core of anger. Gable feigned innocence. "Who? Your hired gun?" Could be he realized this is a losing proposition and moved on. Men of his sort are seldom reliable. He climbed down, his men following suit, their bulk deliberately crowding the space before her door. "Which is what I've come to talk about. This charade has gone on long enough. You're tired. I'm tired of watching this place fall apart. Sign the deed over to me. I'll give you a fair price, more than it's worth, and you can go live comfortably in town. This is my home. Get off my land. She stood her ground, but her heart was a frantic bird against her ribs. Gable's smile vanished. It's a pile of timber on worthless dirt. And you're a stubborn woman standing in the way of progress. He nodded to one of his men, who stepped forward, a thick document in hand. Sign it. No. The man grabbed her arm, his fingers biting into her flesh. She cried out, more in fury than pain, and tried to wrench away. The other man moved to block her path back to the house. Gable watched, a predator enjoying the struggle. It'll go easier if you just see reason, Margaret. From the shadowed interior of the open barn, a figure emerged. Jack moved not with the ringing of spurs or a shouted challenge, but with the silent, lethal grace of a wolf separating a calf from the herd. He must have come cross-country, leaving his horse to draw their attention. His face was a mask of calm, but his eyes held a killing frost Margaret had never seen before. It was not the cold of winter, but the absolute zero of deep space. It was the look of the man he had been, fully awakened and focused on a single, terrible purpose, her. Take your hands off her, he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried in the still air like the cocking of a hammer. All three men spun, shock on their faces. The one holding Margaret loosened his grip for a second, and she tore her arm free, scrambling back toward the porch steps, putting the well between herself and them. Gable recovered first, his face mottling with rage. You. I should have known you'd slink around. Get him. The two hired hands, emboldened by numbers and their employer's command, lunged. What followed was not a brawl, but a brutal, efficient dismantling. Jack didn't brawl. He moved with an economy of violence that was terrible to behold. He used the first man's charge against him, sidestepping and driving an elbow into his kidney with a sickening thud. As the man crumpled with a gasp, the second swung a wild punch. Jack caught the fist in midair, twisted, and swept the man's legs out from under him, driving him into the hard-packed dirt. He placed a boot on the man's wrist, pinning him, his eyes never leaving Gable. Gable, seeing his protection gone, went for the gun at his own hip. He was not a fast man, and his draw was clumsy with panic. He never cleared leather. Jack's own revolver, which seemed to simply appear in his hand, was aimed steadily at the center of Gable's chest before the rancher's fingers even touched his grip. Don't, Jack said. That one word held a universe of finality. The world seemed to freeze. The only sounds were the pained groans of the men in the dirt and Margaret's own ragged breathing. Jack stood, a statue of controlled fury, the gun an unwavering extension of his will. He wasn't breathing hard. He looked utterly at home in this moment of poised violence, and that, more than anything, terrified Margaret. This was his native language. You're finished here, Gable, Jack said, his voice still that low, dangerous monotone. You will get in your wagon. You will leave. If you or any of your men ever set foot on this land again, if you so much as look sideways at Margaret, I will not come for you with the law. I will come for you in the dark. And you will not see me. Do you understand the difference? Gable's bravado had dissolved into pure, pallid fear. He understood. He understood the cold promise in those winter-gray eyes. He nodded, a jerky, pathetic motion. Take your trash and go. Gable scrambled to obey, kicking his groaning men toward the wagon. They hauled themselves in, a tangle of pain and humiliation. Without another word, Gable whipped the horses into a frantic retreat, the buckboard bouncing down the track in a cloud of dust. The moment they were out of sight, the tension snapped out of Jack. His shoulders slumped, a fraction. He holstered his gun with a smooth, practiced motion, then turned to Margaret. The killing frost was gone from his eyes, replaced by a raw, searching anxiety. Did they hurt you? She shook her head, unable to speak. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving her limbs weak and trembling. She saw the fresh cut on his knuckles, the new bruise darkening on his temple from the scuffle. He had fought for her. He had faced down her nightmare and banished it with a terror of his own. The sight of him in that moment of supreme, dangerous competence should have frightened her. Instead, it ignited a fierce, possessive pride that burned away the last of her fear. He took a step toward her, then another, closing the distance Gable had forced between them. He stopped an arm's length away, his gaze roving over her face, checking for injuries she didn't have. The concern there, so stark and tender after the violence, broke something open inside her. Without thinking, she closed the final space. She reached up and touched the bruise on his temple, her fingers feather-light. Then her hands were in his hair, pulling his mouth down to hers. This kiss was nothing like the one in the barn. That had been hunger and surprise. This was claiming, gratitude, relief, and a wild, untamed passion unleashed by danger. It was deep and consuming, a silent scream of everything they had almost lost. She poured all of her terror, her fury, her dawning, undeniable love into it. He met her with equal fervor, his arms coming around her, lifting her off her feet as if she weighed nothing, crushing her against him. The hard evidence of his desire, even more potent now, pressed against her belly. There were no more barriers. No storm to pause them, no propriety left to cling to. The fight had stripped everything else away, leaving only this fundamental, desperate need. He carried her, their mouths still fused, up the porch steps and through the door of the house, kicking it shut behind them with a finality that echoed through the quiet rooms. In the dim light of the parlor, he set her on her feet but did not let her go. His hands came up to frame her face, his thumbs stroking her cheeks as he broke the kiss to look at her, his breath coming in ragged gusts. "Margaret," he whispered, her name a prayer and a question. Her answer was to begin unbuttoning his shirt, her fingers fumbling with the clasps. He helped her, shucking the garment and letting it fall. Then his hands went to the buttons of her dress, his movements urgent but not rough. The fabric, worn and soft, gave way beneath his touch, peeling from her shoulders to pool at her feet. The cool air of the room whispered over her skin, raising goosebumps, but his gaze was a tangible heat, traveling over the curves of her breasts, her waist, the flare of her hips, with a reverence that took her breath away. He bent his head, his mouth finding the sensitive hollow of her throat, then lower, tracing the lace edge of her chemise before he pulled it gently over her head. When he took one pebbled peek into his mouth, she cried out, her knees buckling. He caught her, sweeping her into his arms again, and carried her to the narrow bed in her room. There was no more hesitation, no more patience. What followed was a raw and beautiful collision. He laid her on the quilt, following her down, his body covering hers, skin to skin. The feeling was exquisite, overwhelming, the sheer, solid weight of him, the heat, the contrast of his rough hands on her smoothness. He kissed her everywhere, her mouth, her breasts, the flat plane of her stomach, his touch at once possessive and worshipful. When he entered her, there was a moment of sharp, stretching fullness that made her gasp. He stilled, his body trembling with the effort, his face a mask of agonized pleasure. "Look at me," he rasped. She opened her eyes, meeting his. In that deep, gray gaze she saw not the gunslinger, but the man who had chosen to stay, to fight, to build. She saw her future. She wrapped her legs around his hips, drawing him deeper, answering his unspoken question with her body. Then he began to move, and thought dissolved into sensation. It was a joining that was both a claiming and a surrender. The rhythm they found was not gentle, it was powerful, primal, a physical echo of the storm and the fight. It was the sweat-slick slide of skin, the catch of breath, the whispered, broken words that were more sound than sense. He murmured her name against her skin. She dug her fingers into the hard muscles of his back, urging him on. She shattered first, a wave of pleasure so intense it wrenched a sob from her throat, her body clenching around him. The feel of it pulled him over the edge with her. He called out, a raw, ragged sound, as he spilled himself deep within her, his body shuddering in her arms. For a long time afterward, they lay entangled in the gathering twilight, the only sound their slowing breaths. The sweat cooled on their skin. He shifted to his side, taking her with him, keeping her close. His hand stroked the length of her back, a slow, soothing rhythm. Later, as true dark fell, they stirred. Without words, they rose. He built a fire in the hearth while she lit a lamp. They came together again on the rug before the fire, this time with a slow, explorative tenderness that was the other side of the earlier storm. They learned each other in the flickering light, the curve of a hip, the sensitive spot behind a knee, the way a certain touch could make the other gasp. They loved again, this time with a deep, languorous passion that spoke of time and belonging. As dawn tinged the sky, Margaret lay with her head on Jack's chest, listening to the strong, steady beat of his heart. His arm was around her, his fingers idly tracing patterns on her bare shoulder. The fear of Gable was gone, burned away in their fire. What remained was this, a man and a woman, in a house on hard-won land, their bodies and souls irrevocably joined. The rescue was complete, but it had not been him saving her, or her saving him. It had been them, saving each other, and in the ashes of their old, lonely lives, they had found a new kind of fire to keep them warm. The world, for a time, shrank to the boundaries of the Willow Creek Ranch. The confrontation with Silas Gable had been a wildfire, scorching the earth clean of his poison. Word traveled on the desert wind, carried by freighters and wandering cowpokes, that the widow's place was no longer easy pickings. It was protected, not just by a hired gun, but by a man whose cold, quiet reputation had solidified into legend. More importantly, it was protected by a partnership that had become unbreakable. Jack and Margaret moved through their days in a new harmony, one woven from shared labor and the deep, physical knowledge of each other now freely given and received in the quiet dark of their bedroom. The rhythm of the land became their rhythm. They rose with the sun, their bodies relearning each other in the soft, forgiving light of morning before pulling on work clothes and stepping into the day. The silence between them was now a comfortable, rich thing, filled with the language of glances and touches, a hand resting on the small of her back as she passed him a tool, her fingers brushing his when he handed her a dipper of water from the well. The ranch itself seemed to respond to this new energy. The repaired fences held strong. The cattle, no longer harried, grew sleek on the late summer grass. The garden yielded a bounty Margaret had barely dared hope for, and the pantry shelves grew heavy with jars of preserved tomatoes, beans, and peaches, glinting like rubies and amber in the lamplight. Jack's past was a shadow he no longer turned from, but a part of the landscape of him, accepted as she had accepted the scars on his skin. He spoke of it sometimes, in fragments, as they sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the stars prick through the velvet dark. He told her of the towns whose names all blurred together, of the men who lived by the gun and died by it, their faces now featureless in his memory. He spoke of the deep, abiding weariness that had led him to Bitter Spring, to her doorstep. In return, she shared more of Thomas, not as a ghost to be feared, but as the dreamer who had planted the seed of this life, a seed she and Jack were now tending to full bloom. Their histories, once solitary burdens, were laid down between them, examined, and then folded into the foundation of what they were building together. The change in Margaret was subtle but profound. A lightness entered her step, a softness around her eyes that had been hardened by grief and struggle. She began to sing sometimes, old hymns and folk songs, her voice a low, sweet hum as she worked. One morning, a few weeks after Gable's defeat, she turned from the stove where she was flipping griddle cakes to find Jack leaning in the doorway, simply watching her, a look of such naked, wondering affection on his face that her breath caught. He crossed the room in 2 strides, pulled her into his arms, and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart ache. It was in moments like these that the word love, though still unspoken, hung in the air as plainly as the scent of coffee and frying bacon. It was another morning, shortly after, that a different awareness dawned. Margaret was scrubbing a pot when a wave of dizziness passed over her, followed by a deep, rolling nausea that sent her stumbling to the porch rail. She stood there, gulping the clean air, and a knowing older than time itself settled in her bones. She counted back the weeks, to the storm, to the fire-lit nights that followed. A strange, fierce joy, edged with a sliver of terror, bloomed in her chest. She said nothing that day, holding the secret close, a precious, fragile seed of its own. The final test of their peace came with the first chill of autumn. A rider approached, not from the east where Gable lurked, but from town. It was the sheriff, a grizzled, honest man named Ben Hayes. He tipped his hat to Margaret, who stood on the porch with Jack a half-step behind her, a posture that was no longer protective but simply united. "Came to bring news," Hayes said, his eyes flicking between them with a knowing kindness. Silas Gable packed up lock, stock, and barrel. Sold his spread to a cattle company from back east and lit out for California. Seems he lost his taste for the high desert. His gaze rested on Jack. "Heard you had a talk with him." Jack gave a slight nod. "We came to an understanding." "Well," Hayes said, a slow smile spreading under his mustache. "Seems it held." He looked around the ranch, at the straight fences, the solid barn, the well-kept house. "Place is looking fine. Better than it ever did." He tipped his hat again. "You folks have a good winter." As the sheriff's horse faded into the distance, the last loose thread of threat was neatly clipped. The world was truly, finally, theirs. That night, after a supper eaten in a celebratory quiet, Margaret knew it was time. They were by the hearth, Jack mending a harness, Margaret darning socks. The fire crackled, painting the room in warm, dancing light. "Jack," she said, her voice quiet but clear. He looked up, instantly attentive, the way he always was to her voice. "I'm with child," she said. The words fell into the room, immense and still. Jack's hands froze. The needle slipped, unpulled, from the leather. He stared at her, his face going through a rapid transformation, shock, disbelief, and then a dawning, awestruck wonder that made his eyes shine in the firelight. He set the harness aside as if it were made of glass. "A child," he whispered, the word foreign and miraculous on his tongue. He rose, crossed to her, and slowly sank to his knees before her chair. His big, work-roughened hands came up to cradle her face. "Are you sure?" She nodded, a smile trembling on her lips. "I'm sure." He searched her eyes, looking for any doubt, any fear. He found only a steady, radiant certainty. A low sound escaped him, part groan, part laugh, and he buried his face in her lap, his shoulders shaking. When he looked up again, his eyes were wet. "Margaret," he breathed, her name encompassing everything, his love, his gratitude, his sheer, staggering joy. "This is your home, Jack," she said, her own tears spilling over. She framed his face with her hands. "You're not the hired hand. You're not a gunman passing through. You're the heart of this place, same as me. This child, this is our future. Stay. Build it with me. For always." He surged up, capturing her mouth in a kiss that tasted of salt and promise. It was a seal. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers. I'm not going anywhere, he vowed, his voice thick with emotion. This is where I was always meant to end up. With you. The following months were a time of purposeful, joyful preparation. The ranch work continued, but now there was a new project, preparing the small second bedroom. Jack, with a craftsman's care he'd never shown for mere fence posts, built a cradle from seasoned oak. Margaret lined it with soft, leftover quilt batting. Their lovemaking changed, too, becoming even more profound, a tender worship of the life growing between them. His hands on her swelling belly were reverent, his kisses softer, his passion channeled into a protective, cherishing strength that made her feel more loved than she had ever thought possible. The first snow came early, dusting the high desert in a blanket of quiet white. It was on such a morning, with the world hushed and new, that Margaret felt the first true pang. The baby came as the sun set, painting the snow outside in shades of rose and violet. Jack, who had faced down outlaws without a flinch, was a portrait of pale, sweating anxiety, following the midwife's every instruction with a frantic solemnity. But when the infant's fierce, indignant cry finally split the air, all the tension left him. The midwife placed the tiny, swaddled bundle in Margaret's exhausted arms, then tactfully withdrew. In the soft glow of the oil lamp, Margaret looked down at the perfect, red face, the shock of dark hair, the tiny fist waving. "A son," she whispered, her voice full of awe. Jack knelt by the bed, his gaze locked on the two of them, his family. He reached out a single, trembling finger, and the baby's hand curled around it with a surprising strength. A look of pure, unguarded love transfigured his weathered face. "What shall we call him?" Margaret asked. Jack was silent for a long moment, looking from his son's face to the woman who had given him everything. "Thomas," he said softly. "For the dream that started this. And James, for my father, a good man who never knew a life like this was possible." Margaret nodded, tears of perfect happiness on her cheeks. Thomas James. They stayed like that for a long time, wrapped in a quiet so profound it felt sacred. The ashes of their old lives were far behind them, scattered on the desert wind. Here, in this warm room, was the new life they had forged together, forged from necessity, tempered by danger, and welded solid by a love as deep and enduring as the land itself. The Willow Creek Ranch was no longer a struggling claim. It was a homestead. A legacy. A testament to the unexpected love that could grow from the hardest ground, watered by trust, and built, side by side, into something that would last. Did this story of resilience and unexpected love capture your heart? If you yearn for more tales where wounded hearts find solace and fierce passion blooms against all odds, subscribe to our channel. We journey every week to forgotten towns and rugged frontiers, uncovering stories where love doesn't just survive, it conquers. Join our community of romantics, click subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss a new adventure. Your next favorite story awaits.